Hello and welcome back, grade 12s. So today we are continuing with Unit 2, Human Reproduction, and for this lesson we will be focusing on the menstrual cycle and hormonal control. So the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle consists of two main parts, so two different cycles. One is the ovarian cycle and one is the uterine cycle. Now, the ovarian cycle obviously has to do with development in the ovaries, while the uterine cycle has to do with things happening in the uterus. The menstrual cycle takes place in females, usually over a 28-day cycle, but this may differ from female to female. So the ovarian cycle. This can be divided into three phases. 1, the follicular phase, 2, ovulation, and 3, the luteal phase. Now, during the follicular phase, the development of the primary follicles into a mature Gravian follicle takes place, and this usually occurs between day 1 and 14, so that is this part of the process. And then on day 14, ovulation will occur. So this is the rupturing of the follicle, and an ovum is then released, which you can see there. The luteal phase is the formation of the corpus luteum, and this occurs from day 15 onwards. Okay. So, in the ovaries of the fetus, we know that oogenesis already starts. So during this process, the germinal epithelial cells in the outer layer of the ovary divide and form the oogonia, and we know this from our previous lesson, right? Every oogonium is surrounded by a granular layer, and this is known as the primary follicle as a whole. Okay, and this granular layer is made up of cells from the germinal epithelium. So here's your primary follicle. On the outside layer, that white part you can see there, is the granular layer, and on the inside is the oogonium. Inside the follicles, the oogonia grow into primary oocytes, which we can see there. And this is also in that little diagram in the previous lesson on oogenesis. Then at birth, so this fetus, baby girl, is now born, there are between 700,000 and 2 million primary oocytes in the primary follicles in a baby girl's ovaries. The primary oocyte, they remain dormant until puberty is reached, and many of the primary oocytes will degenerate during the childhood of the girl, and roughly only 400,000 are then present in the ovaries when this girl reaches puberty. Okay? So when the girl reaches puberty, this is usually between the ages of 10 and 12 years, the hypophysis starts to secrete FSH. Now, remember, the hypophysis is a certain part of the brain, and this will secrete FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates the development of the primary follicles into Gravian follicles. So, in other words, the primary follicles will develop into the Gravian follicle. Only one follicle matures in every cycle, and the developing follicle secretes estrogen, responsible for the development of secondary sexual characteristics and the development of the endometrium. So this developing follicle that's now developing into the Gravian follicle will secrete estrogen, and this estrogen is very important for the development of the secondary sexual characteristics that we spoke about in the previous lesson, as well as the development of the endometrium. Now remember, the endometrium is that thick layer on the inside of the uterus in which the egg cell or the embryo will implant. So the primary oocyte divides by meiosis I into two cells, the secondary oocyte and a polar body. Again, you can refer back to that diagram that I gave to you in the previous lesson. So the primary oocyte will then divide and form a secondary oocyte, which we can see there and there, form the secondary oocyte as well as a polar body. Okay, and these are then the haploid cells, because the primary oocyte was diploid, meiosis occurred, and then we have two haploid cells. The Gravian follicle that was then formed moves to the ovary surface where it increases in size and eventually ruptures. So that is what's happening there, that rupture. And the estrogen secreted by the Gravian follicle stimulates the release of LH, and ovulation is stimulated by LH, luteinizing hormone, secreted by the hypophysis. Okay, so now this Gravian follicle will stimulate the release of LH by the hypophysis, and this will stimulate ovulation. Okay. Secondary oocyte, remember ovulation is this rupture. So when this is forming, LH will stimulate this rupturing to take place. A secondary oocyte is released, and ovulation, which usually occurs on day 14, will then happen. So that secondary oocyte is then released, as you can see there. Because of this, LH that was stimulated to be produced by the hypophysis, which then in turn stimulated the ovulation. Okay. After ovulation, the remains of the Gravian follicle develop under the influence of the hormone LH, so luteinizing hormone, into the corpus luteum. Okay, so that Gravian follicle still causes the hypophysis to secrete LH, which will then lead to the formation or stimulate the formation of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone and estrogen to maintain the endometrium for implantation. So should this secondary oocyte that was now released during ovulation on day 14 be fertilized, and the endometrium is ready for implantation, because this corpus luteum that was now formed secretes progesterone and estrogen to maintain that endometrium. If the secondary oocyte is not fertilized, the corpus luteum degenerates. However, if fertilization does take place, the corpus luteum functions and maintains the endometrium until week 12 of the pregnancy. Okay. Then we get to the uterine cycle. So the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, like we said, so this lining inside here of the uterus is rich in glands and blood vessels. The uterine cycle involves monthly changes to the endometrium that starts from puberty and end in menopause. So this is not like oogenesis and the ovarian cycle, which already starts at birth. This now only starts at puberty and ends in menopause. So after ovulation, the uterus should be prepared for implantation to occur, and then obviously this zygote or embryo that implanted needs to be nourished. So again, then also nutrition of the fertilized ovum. Estrogen and progesterone secreted by the ovary are responsible for thickening the endometrium, and that's what we said, that one of the main functions of the corpus luteum is to secrete progesterone, which maintains the endometrium. So if fertilization does not take place, the thickened blood-rich tissue is not needed for implantation, and the upper layers of the endometrium break down and are shed together with the unfertilized ovum. So this is menstruation then, because then that corpus luteum will not produce that progesterone anymore. So the top layer is then pulled out of the body. The ovum and lining exit the body via the cervix and the vagina. Menstrual blood consists of the endometrial tissue, obviously, blood, because this is a very blood vessel rich layer, and mucus. And then menstruation usually lasts for about 4 to 6 days. Again, this depends on female to female. It's not the same for everyone. The endometrium immediately starts to thicken again in preparation for the arrival of the next ovum, so for the next cycle. And some experience pain during menstruation, and others have little or no side effects. So the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle. Now I've touched on many hormones, but now we are going to look at them. So the hypothesis secretes FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and FSH stimulates the development of primary follicles in the ovary into mature Gravian follicles. So here we can see that FSH levels increased, and the primary follicles in the ovary will mature into Gravian follicles. Okay, so the developing follicles then secrete estrogen. So here we can see that the estrogen levels increases as these follicles develop. And estrogen stimulates the development of endometrial tissue and inhibits the release of FSH, thus inhibiting the development of more follicles in order for only one follicle to mature at a time. So here we can see that the FSH levels will decrease as the estrogen levels increase. Okay, and this also you can see here, as the estrogen levels increase, the endometrium, the lining here, becomes thicker. And then high estrogen levels just before day 14 stimulate the production of LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, by the hypothesis. So this high estrogen levels will stimulate LH and FSH to peak, and LH stimulates ovulation and causes the ruptured follicle to be transformed into corpus luteum. So that is what's happening there. Because these two hormones, the LH and the FSH, increase, ovulation then takes place, and that secondary oocyte is released, and the remains turns into the corpus luteum. So FSH causes growth in the Gravian follicle, which stimulates ovulation. That is why this increase will stimulate the ovulation, and the corpus luteum produces progesterone and estrogen. Okay, so now when this corpus luteum is formed, we can see that the progesterone and the estrogen levels increase. Progesterone and estrogen play a role in thickening the endometrium. So again, here you can see that the endometrium is thickened, and progesterone inhibits the release of FSH in order for only one follicle to mature at a time, and it prevents the secretion of LH, thus preventing further ovulation. So here you can see that FSH is decreased, so no more follicles will mature, and LH is also decreased, thus no further ovulation will take place. After day 14, the endometrium thickens as a result of the effects of progesterone and estrogen. So as these levels increase, you will see an increase over here in the thickening of the endometrium. If fertilization does not take place, the corpus luteum degenerates from day 24 onwards. So there you can see it starts to degenerate from here, day 24. And progesterone and estrogen is not produced anymore as the corpus luteum is degenerated. Okay? So here you can see as that degeneration occurs, the levels of progesterone and estrogen, the yellow and the blue lines, they decrease. The shedding of the endometrium then takes place, and FSH secretion is not inhibited, and it can now be released to stimulate the development of new follicles, and the cycle starts again. So then the lining will shed, and these levels will start to increase again, your FSH and your estrogen levels, but mainly your FSH levels, because they are not inhibited anymore by the progesterone and the estrogen. So this is a whole mouthful, and it's a very important process for you to understand. So I suggest that you go through it step by step, while also looking at that graph and really trying to interpret and understand it, not just parroting the work. So you can see that there's negative feedback. Now, what is negative feedback? So negative feedback occurs when there's an increase in the level of one hormone that results in a decrease of the secretion of another hormone. So examples of this in the menstrual cycle include the increase in estrogen secreted by the Gravian follicle, which then inhibits the release of FSH to prevent the formation of more follicles. So we can see here that as our levels of estrogen increased, our levels of FSH decreased. And then increased progesterone and estrogen from the corpus luteum inhibit the release of FSH and LH, which prevents the development of other follicles and of ovulation. So here again, as these two increased, so the progesterone and the estrogen increased, the FSH and the LH decreased. And then when the corpus luteum degenerates, estrogen and progesterone levels drop, and FSH and LH can be secreted again to start the cycle all over again. Okay, so as these drop, your progesterone and your estrogen levels drop, your FSH and LH will increase again to start the cycle from the top. Okay, and then that is it for this lesson.